Here on clickondetroit.com, so much news that one flashpoint a week will no longer suffice. My producer, Olive Hathcanavala, just fainted when I suggested we'll be doing this every week, but I think that's one of our questions. What is the new abnormal? How long will it be this hurly-burly? I'm Devin Skillian. Great to have you with us here from the Local 4 newsroom, and joined right now by Professor Richard Broughton from U of D Mercy. And I wanted to start a little bit, Richard, thank you very much for coming.
Happy to be here.
Because before we get into some of the other ramifications of what's happened today, I want us to get down to some of the brass tacks on this immigration executive order. We got a lot of debates over what it should be called even, which was the subject, interestingly, just now of a news conference, and perhaps you saw Sean Spicer a few moments ago at the White House. But let's start with just the nuts and bolts of a president's ability to direct immigration policy through executive order, which seems to bypass a lot of lawmaking.
Sure, and that's one of the controversies about this particular order. The president has, we know from the text of the Constitution, we know that the president has executive power. All of the executive power is vested in the president of the United States. And to the extent that President Trump can argue that this executive order is designed to protect the American people through the use of executive power, he's going to argue that he has the authority unilaterally under Article 2 of the Constitution to sign these kinds of orders.
Now, we've got a couple of different issues at play here. Number one, our Constitution also that makes it clear that you can't discriminate anyone on the basis of their faith, and there's going to be quite a debate over whether or not this is an anti-Muslim ban. By virtue of the fact that he has singled out 7 nations that are all Muslim nations, but by no means all Muslim nations of the world are included.
That's right.
Can they argue that it's not truly a ban only against the Muslim faith?
Certainly the administration is going to make that argument. They are going to argue that because all Muslims and all Muslim countries were not included, this is not a Muslim ban. The response to that, I think we're already seeing some of the response. We're seeing it in some of the litigation over the course of the last few days. The response is that there is a provision of the executive order that does give our government, the administration, the authority to waive certain exclusions where they are members of a minority religion in the country of origin. And so the argument is going to be made that that is designed to protect a particular religion, namely Christianity, to the exclusion of Muslims. So this is going to be one of the controversies in the litigation going forward. Another controversy is going to be this. Even assuming that this is religious discrimination, and the administration is going to say that it isn't, but even assuming that it is, can the president use his executive authority through an executive order dealing with immigration to exclude people on the basis of religion? That's an open question. It's something that the Supreme Court has not dealt with, but that's going to be a litigated question in this instance.
Now, will it boil down to the way that the directive is actually written, or do extenuating factors come into it? Because we know now from comments from Rudolph Giuliani that President Trump consulted with him and basically said, I want to ban Muslims. How do I do this in a legal way?
Yes.
At least that's sort of the way Giuliani has framed it.
Yes.
Does that conversation matter, or is it simply boiled down to what's on the executive directive?
I think if you're going to challenge the legality of this executive order, that's going to matter a lot, because the administration's argument is going to be on the face of the order, it doesn't discriminate against Muslims writ large, right? Yeah. But the argument is going to be, when you look at the text of the order that makes this exception possibly, or at least gives a waiver possibility to maybe Christians coming from one of the designated countries, that is an indication. And then when you couple that maybe with the intent behind the drafting of the executive order, that's going to be significant. So that, I think, is where Mayor Giuliani's comment is going to become significant, is in trying to demonstrate that the real intent of the executive order was to discriminate against Muslims. Now, the administration is going to push back on that.
Sure.
But if you're litigating this case, I think you're going to make that argument.
The other thing that I'm curious as to the effect that it is a temporary order, what impact that actually has on the argument, because we know, and maybe you don't know because this goes back a ways, but a lot of our immigration policy and refugee policy goes back to an act from Congress in 1980. Now, the president cannot simply, this breaks down to the way that our government system of checks and balances works, the president can't simply create a law that overrides one that Congress has created.
Exactly.
But can the fact that this is a temporary measure be somehow used to mitigate that argument?
Yeah, so this is going to be a litigated question, I think, in these cases dealing with this executive order, is the extent to which the president's order is inconsistent with existing immigration law as passed by Congress. One of the arguments is going to be that the president can't do this, right? He can't, for example, discriminate on the basis of national origin, where Congress has said that you can't discriminate on the basis of national origin. On the other hand, the argument may be, did Congress delegate that power to the president? I mean, one of the things that we know that Congress does in creating these kinds of regulatory regimes is they give a lot of deference to the administration and to the bureaucracy to implement and regulate. So, so one of the open questions here is going to be, does the president have delegated power from Congress? In which case, Congress can't really complain.
Another wrinkle to this goes beyond American law, and that is that we are signatories to a number of international agreements with the UN, particularly those that relate to refugees. So how do we get around that if we look to be breaking our agreement with the other nations of the world?
Legally, that's an interesting question. I think politically, I think you're going to see the administration push back on that by saying, first of all, we're not violating any of our agreements, and second of all, you know, one of the things that we've seen from this administration is maybe they aren't going to be as sympathetic to some of these sort of multinational organizations like the UN. Maybe the argument from the administration is going to be, it's good that America assert its sovereignty in ways like this. One of the sort of underlying sort of core principles, I think, having to do with this executive order is the argument about American sovereignty, that the sovereign should be able to protect itself from dangers coming from the outside. So I think that's all going to be part of this narrative that you're going to see from the administration defending the executive order on grounds of American sovereignty.
And this goes beyond the legal question here, but it's interesting. If you look at the 8 countries that are covered by this, including Syria, the countries that are covered by this, there has never been an example of an immigrant from one of those nations committing an act of terrorism against Americans on U.S. soil. So I guess I'm curious as to how we measure out whether it works.
Yeah, a good question, and we probably won't know, right? At least not for a while. I mean, I think the administration probably would say that these are places where we know that terrorist activity exists, right? We know in particular that ISIS is active in this particular part of the world, and so if we are trying to prevent the spread of ISIS into the United States, the administration would argue these are the countries that you need to focus on. On the other hand, if you're using sort of historical examples of terrorist attacks as your barometer, then it seems to be a sort of under-inclusive list.
Well, we have stays in place right now from some judges, and I'm just curious as to if this was Las Vegas, where would your bet be as to, you've done a great job, I think, of telling us where all of the different stones lie here, but how do you suppose this breaks in the end?
So the litigation is still ongoing. In fact, we just had a new major lawsuit filed yesterday. So, so it's going to take a while for this to play out. We know that in the Brooklyn case, the judge has given the parties until February, the end of February, to complete their briefing on the case. It'll then be heard by the judge. So that's going to give the parties some time, but we know that this is going to be ongoing. What I think is significant is that in each of these cases, the 5 cases from all over the country, one of the legal standards that the plaintiffs in the cases had to meet was they had to show a likelihood of success on the merits. And I think it's noteworthy that 5 federal judges from all different parts of the country believed that there was enough of a likelihood on the merits to grant at least the temporary relief in those cases. Now, whether the temporary...
Which is not to be confused with a ruling against the
measure.
measure.
It's not merits relief, it is not a declaration of unconstitutionality. But I think it is at least noteworthy going forward that these federal judges were willing to at least grant the relief on that ground.
Well, it's interesting. The time element of this, the urgency of it, is clearly of a big issue with the president. He tweeted out that the reason that I did this immediately rather than wait a week was I didn't want any, I think he said, bad dudes, you know, sort of sneaking in under it, although I think that doesn't do justice to what it takes to actually be. It takes about 18 months to be to get a refugee sort of waiver. But the urgency of it, if we're talking about waiting a month before that urgency is kind of washed away.
Yeah. Possibly so. I mean, I think one of the major sort of issues surrounding the executive order now is not just the legality, but the argument, at least, that the sort of the slipshod way in which it was drafted, right? The sort of impetuous way in which it was rolled out, that he didn't get enough consultation from major figures on Capitol Hill or even within the administration. And of course, we know that that had major consequences last night when the acting Attorney General, Sally Yates, issued the guidance to the DOJ employees saying that they weren't to defend this in court. We know that the measure had been reviewed by what is called the Office of Legal Counsel at the Department of Justice, and this is part of what the Office of Legal Counsel does. They examine proposed executive orders for legality and form, but her argument was, she wasn't able to weigh in on it. Others weren't able to weigh in on it, and so one wonders if the president had sought her advice, what would he have done? How would he have responded to it?
That's a good question too.
Yeah.
Last thing, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you about the announcement that's coming tonight. We have two. This is kind of an odd thing. We apparently have two men headed to Washington right now who I guess are considered the finalists, even though the president has said he knows who it's going to be. So we're kind of getting into a reality style announcement. I don't know if one of them gets a rose. Or what. But
it would be funny if they're both standing there next to him at the same time, right? And like on the Celebrity Apprentice,
one of who's been chopped or something.
Yeah, exactly.
But Neil Gorsuch and Thomas Hardiman are the two that it seems to be coming down to. Do you have any thoughts on how this will play out?
Who knows? First of all, I would say that the reporting that I have heard over the past few hours has indicated that maybe Gorsuch is the favorite, although the reporting has also indicated that the president has said he could change his mind at the last second. I think that for those conservatives and Republicans who have been sort of very critical of the president so far and who are a little tense about the last 10 or 12 days, might come away feeling a little bit better tonight. It looks like, assuming that it is Gorsuch or Hardiman, those are going to be acceptable choices to conservative Republicans around the country, fit replacement for Justice Scalia. So my guess is that whatever controversy surrounding the president right now because of this executive order we've been discussing or other actions, some conservatives and Republicans are going to be made to feel at least a little bit better tonight.
Well, and I think important to remember that this is not, by replacing Justice Scalia, there's no net change occurring here in where the makeup of the court has been.
That's right. The chances are this nomination, this appointment, is probably not going to make a substantial amount of difference in any given case. But we'll see. It should be a very interesting evening. So.
Just to get away from 4-4 decisions,
that's right.
Which I guess are not decisions actually.
That's right.
So,
that's right.
Richard, thank you very much for your time. It's been terrific. You gave me a lot to think about there as we on sorting out these issues as we move forward.
Thanks
you
for
very
having
much
me.
for coming. You
All
bet.
right.
We're going to swap Richard out and then bring in our next two guests, and I guess we'll just kind of do it on the fly, Olive. Sure. With very casual here, but great to have you with us here. And while we're getting our new guests to come in, I'll quickly mention that we did just have a news conference there from the White House that addressed a number of topics, not the least of which was what we're just talking about right now with the immigration issue. In fact, the White House really adamant right now that it is not a ban, even though that's the word that President Trump has been using in his tweets. So I guess I'm just going to keep calling it an executive directive. So come on in, Randy, if you would. I'll set you down over here. We've got Randy Richardville stepping in, former leader of the Republicans in the Michigan Senate, majority leader in Lansing, and Dawood Walid, executive director for CARE Michigan. Guys, thanks very much for being here. Really appreciate it. Nice to have you with us here. And Randy, I want to start with you because, in fact, it's interesting when I go back and watch sort of your evolution. There were months ago when I first had you on Flashpoint, and you weren't sure you could get all that, get your hands around Donald Trump, and then we kind of watched you become a supporter of his. I'm curious as to how you feel these last 12 days have gone, and whether they've all gone, if you can wholeheartedly endorse all of it, or if you're concerned about some of it.
A vast majority of it, I am totally behind. I really enjoy the way this gentleman has jumped into the office and took his campaign promises and said, this is what I said I was going to do, and one by one started doing those things, just moving right along. I don't like some of the tweets and Twitters and things that go out. I think, as I was talking at breakfast this morning, no matter who is in the presidency, I thought that it's very important for every American to respect the office of the presidency. Whoever it is, it doesn't matter, because that is one of the most important jobs in the world. Some of these tweets that come out, I don't think are respectful of the position that we elected Donald Trump into. So that was one criticism I have of the way he's done things so far. As far as putting safety as the number one thing that is grabbing a lot of controversy now, I'm okay with that. I don't apologize for that a bit. If he thinks that there are risks of people coming into this country at this point, then I have no problem with him saying, let's take a time out. We said during the campaign this was going to be an important part of our presidency. We need to look at policy and create something that works. We don't have that in place now, so for the time being, we're going to take a time out, hold some people back. It's going to be uncomfortable maybe, but then we're going to move forward. Nothing that Bill Clinton or Barack Obama didn't do as well. So this is just a temporary
Dawood, in fact, that was part of the Sean Spicer's comments a short time ago at the White House, that everybody is kind of really overselling what this is, that it is just a timeout. It's a temporary step while we start to get a better vetting process together. I don't imagine, though, that you share Andy's enthusiasm for it.
It's only partially true because there's an indefinite ban on Syrian refugees.
On Syrian refugees, that's true.
And that is the most displaced group of human beings on Earth since World War II. We have 9-year-olds, orphans displaced, 80-year-old elderly women who've been in refugee camps for over 2 years, who've been vetted, who can't come in. I don't really see any type of national security threat that a 9-year-old Syrian boy or girl would pose to our country. But I would also say, in terms of Mr. Trump's timeout, he's literally just dismissed the intelligence community entirely, as if all of what the intelligence community said, all of us having the most sophisticated intelligence and background check of any country in the history of human civilization, that Mr. Trump just thinks he knows better.
That was what I just suggested to the professor. Just when Donald Trump tweeted out, I had to do this now because if I'd let it go another week, who knows would have gotten on a plane and gotten in here. That kind of dismisses, I don't know if you've ever looked over the 8 or 9 steps that it takes to apply for refugee status. It's about an 18-month process at best. Nobody's getting in here in a week.
Yeah, well, and I totally understand. I think I sympathize with the 9-year-old Syrian or the elderly Syrian that's trying to escape and come into the United States. In that group of Syrians, though, it may be a small percentage, it may be one person. I'm concerned about the 9-year-old citizen of the United States. I'm concerned about the 80-year-old woman that's lived here all of her life. I'm concerned about the risk that somebody from that country comes in, and there's intelligence that says that a lot of bad stuff is happening over there, and that's why we got to be careful of some of these people coming in. So if we hold it back for a while to make sure that we're safe, and those people that have made this country what it is are safe, I'm okay with that. Again, for a temporary, short-term kind of situation until we get something more solid in place and a vetting process that makes sense.
Well, but see, then it gives the assumption that somehow or another Muslim, just by being a Muslim, poses more of a national security threat than someone else being Christian. Is really interesting too. I think that we as Americans are really poor students of history, and we continue making the same mistakes over and over again. We exclude people based upon nationality. We exclude people based upon religion, and then later we go back and regret decisions we make. For instance, in 1939, there was an executive order that basically would not allow Jewish refugees fleeing Nazi Germany to come to America. They were turned back, they were killed, based upon a 1924 Exclusion Act, Immigration Exclusion Act, which basically banned most of the Muslim world from being able to come here, as well as Eastern Europeans. So we have this tendency of people who we don't think are Christian enough or white enough, that somehow these people are the first people that get excluded from immigration and visa. And this is historical. We know the Chinese Exclusion Act, there's several acts. So this is really no new phenomenon.
But the Trump White House has said that these are the nations that the Obama White House picked as being the ones where danger is occurring. That they're not the first one. They took the step of creating this exclusionary period for admission to the U.S., but that these are the same nations that were of concern to the Obama White House too.
these same nations that we bombed to bits. Basically every country, all 7 countries on that list, we bombed them to bits and or we funded, gave logistical support and arms, like Saudi Arabia is bombing Yemen into bits right now. I think that our country has done a good job thus far. We haven't had a single Iraqi or Syrian refugee, starting from the war in which we invaded Iraq off of past pretenses, that have committed a terrorist attack against the homeland. So I think if we look at empirical data and take a step back from being so emotional, there have been people who've been banned or blocked from coming into America on an individual basis. Our government has said that, but there are many people who come here who live fruitful lives, who've contributed to the metropolitan Detroit community, who are refugees, and we at Care Michigan have actually helped many of these people on a personal basis. So I think it's overreacting, and I also think that when we start going into this thing about making special exceptions for Christians but not Muslims, that we are really trampling on the spirit of the founders of this nation, that this should be a land where anyone can come and freely worship and not be discriminated against or blocked based upon their religious expression.
When they've said that it's not about religion, when you include an exclusion for minority faiths in these other nations like Christians, who no doubt are persecuted and have a very rough go of it in many Muslim nations, but when you're saying it's not about religion and then you do that, aren't you making it about religion?
Well, it certainly sounds like it, yeah. That piece of it, you know, I'd have to look a little bit closer at what the language says, because I haven't studied this executive order by any means. I am not looking at this and supporting this as having anything to do with discrimination against faith or people of color. I want you to know that. I am here totally supporting this policy, totally supporting this directive, because I'm concerned about the safety of Americans. It's at it, primarily those in Michigan, and that's it. And you said, let's take an empirical look at it. This was your words, take an empirical look at it, and then take a step back and not be emotional about it.
Sure.
I think what Donald Trump says is, let's take a time out, take an empirical look at it, and not be so emotional about it. So I would use those words
but
back in
the FBI
return.
and CIA has already done the data. You can go on FBI.gov and we can see actually the amount of terrorist attacks have taken place in 20 years. You can go on FBI.gov. You can go on FBI.gov, and we can see that in the past, decade, there's been about 300 Americans that have been killed relating to terrorism, okay? And then many of those have been domestic terrorists, too. We have people like Dylan Roof, right? But then we've had 300,000 Americans to be killed by gun violence. So, I mean, like, a lot of this is just a really emotional debate. Again, and I will say this again, we have not had a single Iraqi refugee, Muslim, a single Syrian refugee that has committed an act of terrorism and killed Americans here at the homeland. So I think the proof is in the pudding.
It would be interesting if Donald Trump were to say, look, I've decided we're going to put a 120-day moratorium on handguns while we figure this out.
I think there would be less chance of him doing that as maybe his predecessor. But let me address something, because I think this is important.
To be a terrorist organization. The Ku Klux Klan is not even designated as a terrorist organization.
I think we're going a little far with comparing the Ku Klux Klan to what's happening right now.
Oh, the Ku Klux Klan is the most notorious terrorist organization in American history.
But let me address what you made a point that there were 300,000 people killed by handguns. And I think what's going on here, when you talk about 300 people that were actually killed in the last decade versus 300,000 with handguns, the fact that you merge those together into one thing is, I think, what this is more about. This is what it is. Both candidates in this last campaign were very far apart. People were very emotional following this one, very emotional following this one, and hated the other one. And now, 1-1. And now we've got a rise of emotion, and I understand it, because people are really concerned. I think people that are on the opposite side of where I am are really concerned about what this president's going to do and how he's going to do it. And I understand that. I just don't think we should pick apart everything that he does, when I believe this makes a lot of sense for the safety of the people that live around me and live around this country.
And I can appreciate your position, but it's not just about intention, it's about impact. And when you have people right here who have their families directly affected, when you have people like myself who have relationships and people have business relationships, I mean, look at Google, for God's sake. Like, they can't even get their employees to come here, or they sound an advisory, where it literally has an effect on our economy, where it has an effect on people's families of visiting for family situations, getting medical care, for God's sake. Like, it doesn't directly affect you, so maybe it's less emotional, but when you have people we have 300,000 Muslims here in metropolitan Detroit. I know several families that are directly impacted. So, you know, when a group of people aren't impacted, it's really easy to say don't get emotional, but when you are directly affected, then it's a different story when people feel like their rights are being violated.
Yeah.
Help sort my way through Syria right now. I'm a little bit, you know, we go through these, the old, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and then Benjamin Netanyahu said sometimes the enemy of my enemy is my enemy. Where our allegiances in Syria are very muddled right now.
Yes.
Trying to figure our way forward. We're watching this mass of refugees with no place to go. Assad has killed many of his own people, which is what we saw Saddam Hussein do in Iraq back at the time. And yet, Donald Trump seems to be aligned with the actions of Russia in Syria because they also seem to be, though, at odds with ISIS. Where do we put our hopes and our, maybe more importantly than our hopes, our support in Syria?
I think we do a lot of prayer, but also reach out to our elected officials. And at the end of the day, Daesh, or what people say ISIS, is a small yet very dangerous group, right? But at the same time, aligning ourselves with Russia, in which Russia is tied to Bashar al-Assad, the number of people that ISIS has killed looks cute in comparison to the amount of people that Bashar al-Assad has killed.
But I guess I feel like those are my only choices, ISIS or Assad.
Well, I think
I don't like them.
I think then becomes the question is like of our humanity, right? So do we not care about all those Syrians who are being killed over there because we are more concerned about about our own backsides? But at the end of the day, it's a really difficult issue. It's a real difficult challenge, and I know that Donald Trump is also not in favor of arming any of the Syrian rebels as well. So it's really complicated.
Randy, you grew up like I did in the Cold War, and to watch this relationship now that we're watching evolve in very unusual ways, where the former head of the KGB is now the president of Russia. Are you comfortable with the way that this is evolving?
I'm not comfortable with a whole lot of what's happening on the world stage right now. I mean, it's confusing, and you don't know who your friends are and who your friends aren't. And I think we share a similar concern for the people that live here. And you're right. I don't know the kinds of people and the impacts that these directives are having on some of the families that live right here in Michigan. I'd like to know more about them. I think that's one of the reasons that we live in a great country, because we can disagree wholeheartedly, but we can learn from each other too. And so I'm glad that you took the time to be here and to talk about that. It doesn't back me down.
We can talk later.
It doesn't back me down at all from my position. I do have the concern about the people that are here, that have been living here for a long time, and the threats that are coming from all over the world. I mean, they're very scary. And I was watching the gentleman, and his name eludes me right now, the other day on television, explaining that the basic ISIS terrorist plan is to come in quietly, infiltrate neighborhoods and all, and then come out and do terrible things to the people that they seem peaceful and good about. So there's some really good people that are coming to this country to live the kind of lifestyle that we can live, that are going to be inconvenienced for a while. And I know it's going to be uncomfortable, but I'm okay with that as long as it's short term, and the people that are coming, if we stop one or two of those people, I'm okay with being inconvenienced for a little while.
See, we don't know if we're stopping one or two, and this goes back to the whole thing because it's completely unscientific.
That's what I said.
But
How
I don't
are we
want to
going to
take
measure
that
its
chance.
success?
I'm not willing to take that
But
chance.
how are we going to measure its success because of the nations that are involved in this? There has not been one episode of one of those immigrants or refugees carrying out an act of terrorism on U.S. soil. So if we go through this 120 days without an act of terrorism, how do we measure that as success? How do we decide whether this
I don't
is
know how to
working?
measure success, but I know how to measure failure.
If
If anybody came in, the idea of coming out a week early and it's a little bit haphazard, it doesn't have all the T's crossed and the I's dotted, so that we can't have people sneaking in. These are people that think. They're not dumb. They're just misguided. And if they have a way to get in, they're going to find a way to get in. So I have a terrible concern about about that?
I have a terrible concern, according to the Department of Homeland Security. I'm more concerned, actually, about a white supremacist going to a black church or a mosque and killing people, how that white supremacist did in Quebec City. Americans are far more likely to be killed in domestic terror sites by white supremacists, but we don't have a special de-radicalization or a special program of surveilling and stopping white supremacists. So, I mean,
I'd be open to hearing one if you have one.
It all depends on perspective. Well, I mean, you know, whiteness is in the privileged group in society, so that's why, hence, there's a lesser discussion about it. But again, I think that we need to take a step back, and I agree with you. We shouldn't all be emotional. Let's take a step back and look at the empirical data of actually what our CIA, what our NSA says, our FBI about the actual threats to our homeland, and actually who is killing Americans. Because someone is dead regardless whether they get shot by a mass shooting or something like the Boston bombing. So I'm concerned for all Americans.
Yeah, it seems to me that more Americans are killing each other than anything else. So I agree with you. That's a systematic problem. We got to get to it.
What is the best way for us to, and I've talked about this in the past, but just for the purposes of us sitting here now, the best way of addressing radicalized, militant, violent Islam, which I'm hesitant to even call. I know you wouldn't even call that Islam.
There's 52 Muslim countries in the world, and the vast majority of them don't have any sort of terrorism brewing. In most of those countries in which we see the growth, like for instance, there was no Daesh or ISIS 15 years ago. I think we need to use some critical thinking and say, how did this group start? Why or how are they using a lot of American armaments and arms, right? Or better yet, how did Al-Qaeda get started? Who supported Osama bin Laden and trained him? Who supported the Taliban? If we'll go back and look at it, we helped in creating the environment for a lot of this radical extremism that if you look back at the Muslim world 40 years ago, you may have seen some radical Arab nationalist organizations, but they weren't doing things in the name of Islam. So what I think is that we need to take a look, okay, we need to intervene and also try to deal with terrorists abroad and stop them from coming here. But at the same time, we need to look back at our policies and see, are we as a country, are we creating unintended consequences by invading countries on false pretenses, arming extremists, training extremists, and then we want to come and bomb them afterwards?
My political mentor has always taught me that there's no such thing as permanent friends or permanent enemies, only permanent interests. And that's why I ask you about Syria. We have chosen poorly time and time again. The Shah, that in the long term have held us in poor stead, and that's why I'm asking, how do we move forward without just doing nothing, which will be its own kind of judgment that is weighed on us in the future.
Well, maybe,
or do we do nothing?
Well, maybe it might seem painful for a while, but I think we need to stop putting our nose in foreign countries' businesses and propping up dictators and supporting dictators for our own selfish interests, and maybe that will help make our country more safer in the long term. Like keep in mind, like Mr. Trump, who has business holdings in Gulf countries. He didn't put Saudi Arabia on that list, right?
Well, then I would suggest that maybe you're in agreement with what appears to be an isolationist pose by him to draw ourselves back in and put America first. You sound a little bit like Donald Trump on that part.
But see, he's not. I don't think he's going to be a pure isolationist, and hence his alliance with Putin and that whole scheme. I believe he has a global outlook, and he may say one thing overtly, but then we have to see what the proof is in the pudding again. I'm using that saying.
Well, he's operating what I think is from a position of strength. He's doing what he said he would do in the campaign. He's been in office for 12 days? Not quite a full 12 days, I don't think. And he's doing what he said he would do. Does it cause concern? Is it a little scary? Probably more for you than for me. I like seeing somebody moving forward, doing what they said, not sitting back. I'm surrounded by politicians.
He's acting like a king right now because
I don't think he's acting like a king.
He criticized President Barack Obama for overusing executive order, so maybe he should go through Congress a little more with some of these decisions.
We haven't really had much of a chance to. I think Barack Obama issued 6 orders, and he's issued 5 so far. So your guy's got 20% more.
No, let me get this straight. Barack Obama's not my guy. I didn't vote for him in that last election.
Did you vote at all, though?
I did vote, but I didn't vote for Barack Obama.
Okay, I'm thinking that's a good thing, but I'm not sure.
I think that's good. That's terrific conversation. I think you both made the point that to be agreeable in your disagreement is heartening for me. It's what we're trying to do at Flashpoint. I appreciate you both being here.
Definitely.
Thank you very much, guys. And thank you for watching as well. Yes, Olive, you got to get busy now on the real Flashpoint coming up. Not the real one, the broadcast side. They're all real. Goodness gracious, listen to me. That's going to do it for us here. Thanks for being with us on clickondetroit.com. Another a complete wrap-up of another very full day, both on the national and international front when you join us tonight on Local 4 News starting at 4. Have a great afternoon.